Yes, guys, what is going on? Welcome back to another episode of the Adapt Performance Podcast. So in today's podcast, I am joined by Lee Bell, and I know Lee from our time at Sheffield Hallam University. So he's one of the lecturers there. Just a super nice bloke. You know, he's got a dry sense of humour, which I'm all for. And we had a little bit of a chat before we actually, pressed go with the record. And, I thought it was going to be an absolute swear-a-thon. And it actually wasn't. I think we might have had one or two swears, but that's cool. In terms of what we're going to cover today, then, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion around overtraining. What is overtraining in its definition, and how does that actually influence training? We speak a little bit around deloading and some of the research implications and what we actually don't know about all these different topics that as coaches and athletes we accept that we know stuff when we probably don't. So there's a lot of assumptions that go on. We speak a little bit around technology, we speak a little bit around research design, but just a really sick, informative episode. And Lee speaks super well, you'll get that. And if you're watching the video, you'll see he's got like an absolute Thor of a beard. He's got it going on at the minute. So without further ado, we're going to get into the episode with Lee. If you enjoy this episode, give it a little share for us. Tag me, tag Lee, just so we know that we're doing the right stuff and, you're actually getting value out of these types of podcasts and discussions. Okay. So, right, there it is. That is my intro. I've kept it short and sweet. Usually I waffle on. So here we go. This is the podcast with Lee. Yes, Lee, how's it going, mate? Welcome to the podcast.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome, mate. You're welcome. I've already complimented you before we went live on air, but how lovely your voice sounds. You've got an expert mic, and I can tell you're prepared for today.
Thank you. Not intentional, but I'm glad it's working okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Sweet. So give us a quick rundown, mate. Who is Lee Bell, and why have I got you here today, then?
So I'm a senior lecturer in sport and exercise science at Sheffield Hallam, of which I have been at Hallam now for 6 years. Previous to that, I've done lots of different roles within strength and conditioning, fitness, exercise referral, lots of different things really, that have sent me full circle back into originally the degree that I did. I'm qualified in, passed the degree in 2003, I think it was, several years ago. But I must admit that when you kind of invited me onto the podcast and you said, I want you to talk about your research, the overtraining, the deloading, which kind of like exact opposites of the training scale. One is like what happens when you train too much, intentionally or unintentionally. And the other is what happens when you intentionally or unintentionally decide to take time away from training. And I think as I was having my coffee this morning, I had a bit of an existential crisis, if I'm being honest, because I was thinking about it, and one probably doesn't exist. And the other, in the traditional sense, we probably don't even need. So it got me thinking, is my research of any value whatsoever? I have no idea. But that in itself perhaps adds some value. So one of the things I want to talk today about is kind of defining those terms, thinking about those concepts, thinking about the state of the current research, where I feel that research wants to go next, some of the issues that I have with the current research as well. So this may be a long episode. I'm not entirely sure, but let's see how it goes.
You know what? And I think I was also having a little bit of a chat as I'm walking around the house this morning, eating my porridge. I'm like, right, let's think about deloading, overtraining, all those types of topics. And I got thinking through, I guess, potentially the perception, if somebody is doing their PhD or research in a particular topic, that they are for that particular thing. So if you are a velocity-based training guy, then you must use that for everything that you do. And I think this is probably where you're going to dispel the myth around overtraining, deloading, and what you actually think about it. So, I'm buzzing for this, mate. So I guess, where do you want to start with this? Is this like clearing up some definitions? Is that how we go about it?
Probably. Yeah, probably. Although I think probably one step before that is just maybe why I chose these topics as my field. Yeah. Because I think that's, like you've just said, Dennis, I think that the tendency is when you choose to research something is because you advocate it already in practice, particularly in our field anyway, in strength and conditioning, and you want to learn a little bit more about it, the kind of theoretical, conceptual underpinnings. For me, it was different because it was almost by accident. So I did my MSc in exercise physiology. That was in 2011, so that's also quite a while back, yeah. And that was one of the first cohorts where you could choose to drop onto another research project, help to collect the data, and then use some elements of that data to inform what your dissertation would be. At the time, there were some very high level endurance athletes, triathletes, marathon runners. And the project lead was collecting some data around what happens when they train too hard, essentially. So it wasn't necessarily looking at overtraining, but it was a broad banner of what happens in general and some of the factors that influence kind of recovery capacity, things like that. So I just dropped on it because, it seemed quite interesting, although I don't really have any interest in endurance training. I was interested in knowing a little bit about kind of, when is too much. Mm-hmm. When I was doing the lit review, being interested in kind of strength and physique sports primarily, as I'm going through each study, I'm kind of going, okay, endurance sports will include that. Okay, endurance sports will include that. Kind of going, like, where are the strength studies? Where's the resistance exercise research? And it played on my mind quite a lot. And in the end, I was lucky enough to get that project published as a systematic review. And then I went, I need to go back to this because there are 200 plus studies, and this is in 2013 when I finally got it published. The 200 plus studies in endurance sports around overtraining. So all of the definitions, all of the concepts, all of the list of symptoms are based around sports like running and cycling and distance swimming. But there was nothing that used resistance exercise as a modality. That's why I arrived at this destination as a PhD, because it's a gap, but it's something that I'm also interested in. So it wasn't, I advocate it. I don't think you can. I don't think it makes sense to advocate overtraining. But it was like, I need to figure something out here because all I can use at the moment is literature that's informed by a sport that is completely the opposite, the way we train, the adaptations we try and create, the models of training that we follow are completely different. So it makes sense that the symptoms of training too hard would be different as well. And that's what got me started on this PhD project and my kind of research field in general.
That's sick. So yeah. I guess I'm curious around this in terms of your own training then, and what you see from coaches is, I'm thinking about my own practice. Yeah. And, if we take, I've used this example on the podcast before around residual training effects and issuing and the shelf life of different adaptations. But we just accept that for being true because it's written by some bloke who we've probably never even heard of, or never seen. And I think deloading is probably very much one of those as well, Yeah. It's that 3-to-1, that type of thing that's just been passed down. So yeah, I'm looking forward to you myth busting here, mate.
Yeah. Maybe let's start with the overtraining, because I think that then gives us a starting point for trying to understand why we might need to deload, why we might not need to deload as well. So overtraining is a difficult word to understand because it has multiple meanings. It has different meanings within the peer-reviewed literature, even right up to the ECSS, ACSM Joint Task Force Consensus Statement, which is where a group of experts have said, right, we need to define the concepts, we need to talk about the symptoms, and we need to talk about how we can avoid it or recover from it. Even the literature or even the language of it that's used in that text is broad, it's vague, and at times is kind of paradoxical. But then when we go on, social media, I love social media for research because it tells me what the coaches think the terms are. And when we talk about, when we see infographics around overtraining, it's always cast with a negative light as such. So, let's talk about overtraining as a process and then probably as an outcome. So as a process, overtraining is a verb. It just means training above recovery capacity. So we could do that intentionally. Maybe we have a phase of training, a cycle of training where we go, you know what, we're not competing for a while. Let's just ramp up training. And typically that's to create adaptations based around a dose response. So muscle hypertrophy or strength. Yeah. We might do it unintentionally because we decide to change our training at the last minute. We do too many sets, or it may well be that, stress is stress. We are trying to maintain our current training levels whilst trying to manage assessment deadlines, long work hours, minimal sleep. So that can have an effect on our recovery capacity. So overtraining is very much a process. As an outcome, what we need to talk about firstly, I guess, is the overtraining syndrome. So that is what happens when you train too hard or you limit recovery, a combination of the two. it's called a syndrome because it's multifactorial, and it is a very complex medical disorder that needs a medical professional to diagnose it. So in that task force document, it has quite a long flow chart of questions that you need to ask your athlete as a medical professional to arrive at a destination of saying, yeah, we need to diagnose you with overtraining syndrome, and this is what happens next. And there are a few checkpoints there where actually you need to be training very, very hard, very, very frequently to even deserve to be asked the question to whether you have overtraining syndrome. Now, again, in the task force document, and when we look online and when we look in the published research, the overtraining syndrome is often shortened to overtraining, which then becomes the verb again. So we're using the same word to describe a process of training, which might be a good thing or a bad thing, and a medical condition, a complex one, that is clearly a bad thing. So even in the language that we use, we kind of need to be aware of the context of it. And that's why there have been attempts in the past to redefine the overtraining syndrome. So, the unexplained underperformance syndrome, that was one from, I think, around the year 2000. Didn't really catch any weight outside of the UK. But it was an attempt to kind of just go, look, overtraining is the process. We need to think about the medical disorder. And then quite recently, there was the paradoxical deconditioning syndrome, which is a little bit of a mouthful. And, again, unsurprisingly, didn't really catch on because the word overtraining is now ingrained in our training psyche. So, for me, the initial stages of the PhD were trying to unpick that language, and also try and kind of gather what coaches understand that to mean as well.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things I picked out from there, mate, which I thought was really interesting and probably doesn't get spoken about enough, is you've got the training. Okay, that's great. You've got a training load. You've got the recovery aspect of it. Then you've got this whole other 23 hours of the day of life. Okay, you've got assessments, you've got kids, you've got stress, and how that itself is putting into that concoction, that mixing pot of issues. And that's something I've definitely toyed with as a coach. Like, where do I sit with training? Like, do I want to overcook it? Do I undercook it, knowing that there is going to be so much other stuff going on? And this is different athlete to athlete, team to team, and sometimes you have more control over those things. But I thought it was just worth highlighting there how multifactorial this thing is.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things that we are looking at now, and I will probably spend the remaining part of my career trying to analyze, is that inter-individual variability. We know, don't we? You know this as a coach. I know it as an academic, that you can give a number of people the same training program, they'll respond differently. Some will just soak up volume. Some can just tolerate it, and you can keep giving it to them, and they're like, coach, just keep training coming, and they respond positively. Some don't respond positively, but their personality is that they want the challenge. So it's understanding the kind of psychophysiology of the athlete. And again, we see that in our research so far, where, athletes are coming in the gym and kind of saying, the previous day of training has really beat me up. Like, I really feel sore, and I would normally have a light day. And you go, okay, well, that's kind of tough because you're doing a tough training session today anyway, for the sake of science. So, you do your kind of pre-testing, and you realize that the counter movement jump hasn't decreased. So even though they're reporting soreness, they're still jumping as high. Neuromuscular activity is still on point. We might do some kind of heavy potentioactive lifting. They seem to be moving quite well. The velocity measures are saying, yeah, everything seems to be okay. And then they'll complete a better training day than they did the previous day. And, it's not being led by the perceptual element of training, or using our experience as a coach to kind of just go, look, I know that you're a bit of a complainer as an athlete. I know you're going to tell me you're sore, but look, you're in the middle of a really hard microcycle. That's almost, in a sense, the purpose of it. The purpose is to try and invoke as much adaptation as possible. And unfortunately, muscle soreness comes with that, and tiredness comes with that. But look, in a few days' time, you then get to take a few days off. We can decrease your overall training stress. And let's keep our fingers crossed that we'll then see, big rebound effect. And that positionality is just as important as understanding the athlete's personality, because we're not going to start to have, we're not going to double volume for a microcycle right in the middle of a competitive season, because we know that soreness will potentially affect performance on the field or on the court. So there are two things there where it comes down to, I think, pragmatic coaching is understanding the athlete understanding the positionality within that annual plan and kind of marrying it all up, really, like using our experience.
And that's, I was having a discussion the other day, mate, around AI and its role in the future of S&C, and I feel like AI is going to help coaching in a lot of ways around data analysis, that type of thing. It's going to kind of free up time so that coaches can do what they do best and, buy-in and the online coaching Nor's word of accountability and all that type of stuff. And that's one right there is like actually just having a good understanding of the person. I don't know if AI will ever get to that point where it can decipher those things. Maybe it can, maybe it can't, but it's that gut feeling element, isn't it?
It is. I think that, and I'm sure you've done the same. You plug a few keywords into AI to see what kind of program comes out, and you're like, actually, it's not bad as a basic program. But it's then, how do you inform those acute decisions that need to be made on a day-to-day basis? You can't purely just do it off the objective data. You can't do it just off the subjective data. It is, again, about marrying it up and making those pragmatic decisions. It's where evidence-based practice becomes practice-based evidence. That experience as a coach is key, and I don't think that AI will ever be able to overcome that, more so with the overtraining research, because there isn't one single symptom that you can say we need to reel training back, because everyone is highly individualized. And in the endurance literature, for example, there are 100 plus different symptoms that have been proposed as potential prognostic markers where you go, oh wow, that's elevated or that's decreased, we need to reel your training back in. But again, with the example I've just given you there, is even though there may be one or two markers that are kind of skewed out of balance, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to wrap your athlete up in cotton wool. There could be potential to keep them going. So really it's about, if you feel, for example, that we have an opportunity to go, tell you what, let's experiment a little bit. Let's try a really challenging microcycle to see how you respond. You don't do it right before competition. You probably do it way off from competition to see how the athlete responds, make tweaks where you need to, and kind of figure it out for that specific athlete. Don't think AI will ever figure that out. I hope not anyway, because then we're all out of the job,
what
right?
are we doing then? You could be a beard model, mate. You've got that coming on.
Yeah, thank you, mate. Yeah, definitely.
It's coming through. Mate, and that's, I was thinking then, so I did an internship in America maybe, I don't know how many years ago now, let's say 10 years or whatever it was. And the guy who I was kind of interning under is called Matt, and he just loved training, probably to the point of his detriment, actually.
Yeah.
But, we got chatting around, stuff we were good at, stuff we weren't good at. And we decided that we were both shit at pull-ups, and we were like, right, okay, by the end of this 6 weeks, mate, we're both going to be sick at pull-ups. What it ended up being was very much like I'm not going to say alpha males, but two people that are competitive, just bouncing off each other. So it was like, right, we're going to do pull-ups every single day that you're here. We'll start off at 50 a day. You'll have one day off a week, so we'll do Sunday because I used to stay at home. And then before you knew it, so the first week was 50. We climbed 20 every single week. So it went 70, 90, 110, 130. I think we got up to 150 a day. And I'm not kidding. Like, I felt dreadful, as you can imagine. Like, my elbows were going to explode. It was a bad time. And obviously, you write that down on paper. You're like, okay, on one hand, if you want to get good at something, probably do it pretty often. On the other side, you've got this kind of almost falling off the cliff. But you know what? When I came back to the UK, probably didn't do any pull-ups for about 2 weeks. And then I was like, well, fuck it, right, let's try it. So did a 1 rep max, and I gained about 20 kilo on a pull-up, and genuinely just gained it in that day. And it just felt amazing. And that was from relatively good numbers from, I think it was 32 to 52. So it was like big increases for somebody who's already relatively strong. And that was me kind of thinking, fuck, I feel like everything I know is almost a lie or not, or I don't know why I think I know this thing. It's really interesting.
Yeah. So I think, typically when we're taught about effective programming, it's always, specificity, progressive overload. Of course, exercise needs to be specific, but progressive overload is not the only approach to improving performance. So in my mind, when I think about progressive overload, what I think is we train, then we recover, we adapt, we improve, we train again, and we're better. So it's train, recover, adapt, train, recover, adapt, train, recover, adapt, and we're seeing upward trend in performance, whatever falls in line with the specifics. What you're talking about there is an overreach or an impact cycle. And what that is rather than, train, recover, it's train, then recover, and then see what happens afterwards. Now, what happens afterwards is a concept called supercompensation kinetics. And that, again, is highly individualized. And this is perhaps where the deloading and tapering stuff comes in, because you improved, how many days did you say? 2 weeks?
That's about 2 weeks off, yeah.
Yeah. So what we see, and there's only a few studies on this, is that some athletes will peak at about 7 days. So 7 days off whatever that stimulus was, and then you improve and you see that, that supercompensation effect. Some athletes are still in the hole. They're still way down here at 7 days, but at 14 days, well, they see that supercompensation, effect. So then it's kind of like, well, actually, it's not just understanding the training that you're giving to the athlete, but it's understanding then what type and duration and magnitude of recovery is needed to see that upward inflection in performance improvement as well. So to kind of I think my area is quite niche, but in order to understand it, lots of different things are all funneling into this variability in response again.
So where do you see the future of that then? So you spoke through, some athletes being in the hole. I took a little bit longer and then eventually came out of it. What's the future here? Like, how do we better inform our practice, do we think, to get that point right?
I think experience as a coach will always be primary. I don't think you can ever try to remove that. And again, that's why a lot of my research focuses on speaking to high performance coaches and saying, what is it that you do? Because I want to take that to the lab. I want to work out why it's working to see if it can be refined, not, what some coaches perceive an academic researcher to be, which is, the white lab coat on doing nerdy shit and then going, you've been doing it wrong. You need to do it this way. And I'm like, I've coached world champions, you not, so it's using that as a starting point. Well, for me, the dream would be, and whether this is even physiologically possible or not, I have no idea, but the dream would be to identify either genetic, phenotypical, or personality characteristics that then steer or pivot the way that we might prescribe training. So, and this is completely, hypothesized, but you will respond really well to a high volume but moderate intensity planned overreach. You'll break. You need to do high intensity with moderate volume. You need to do high frequency. You need lots of variation because you don't like monotony. So I think that there's a way that it can be flipped to prescribe training. But again, I think it would be quite naive if I said, oh, there's one particular genetic marker that would inform that. I think it's about understanding the full profile of the athlete.
It's I kind of see it as like a Rubik's Cube, mate. You turn one and you've turned a few things and you've got so many different things that it's going to be so difficult to do.
Yeah.
And I don't know enough about this topic. And, I can remember seeing it written down. Christian Tiabodu from T Nation. So I don't know if he created this or it was something that he just speaks about, was the what do you call it? Like
neurotyping.
Yeah. Is that related to what you kind of mentioned there, or is that a little bit more kind of wishy-washy in relation to it?
I'm semi-familiar with Christian's work, more so because I think when I first started getting into training, T Nation was the Bible.
T Nation.
Yeah. I still think one of my proudest moments is getting an article in there, like scrap academia, and just
love it.
That and muscle and strength. That's the pinnacle of the career. No one else cared, but I did. It kind of similar-ish. But I think that this would be based on sounder scientific principles. And as I said, it kind of sounds like his ideas are a little bit woo. I've not gone into any great depth of them. It's not a million miles away. But mine, I think, is more focused around the genetic principles. So that could be something as simple as fiber typology, which we know influences training and response to training. So it may well be, as a coach, I can't biopsy an athlete. What's the simplest way to figure out their tendencies and muscle typology tendencies? How can we use that to inform training?
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so that's where we are in terms of overtraining then. So what's kind of the next step with this?
I think what we need to talk about is, I said right at the beginning, this is perhaps something that doesn't exist. Now, I'm kind of overstating that a little bit. What I mean is that we've actually never seen it in the published literature. There's never been a case of the overtraining syndrome published in the literature. And this is actually included in endurance sports as well. So the definition presented of overtraining syndrome, or colloquially overtraining, in that task force document is that there is a reduction in performance that's caused by too much training. But that reduction in performance, which is the key marker, that's the criterion marker, persists for several weeks. Now, you could ask 100 people what several weeks mean, and you could get anything from 3 weeks to 12 weeks. So it's very vague. It's very, very broad. When you look at the flowchart for diagnosis, one of the very first questions, well, actually, the first question is, have you trained more than 5 times a week? If not, you're just a little bit tired, mate. Just suck it up. But the next question is, have your symptoms of, fatigue and performance decrement lasted for longer than 4 weeks? So several weeks in that context, essentially, 4 weeks. Now, you go back to the published literature, and all of these studies in endurance training, not one of them has done a follow-up at 4 weeks. They've all theorized that there's been a reduction in performance that's caused by too much training. It must be the overtraining syndrome. In strength training, there's hardly any literature anyway. But even when, mad scientists have just gone, I'm a bit of a sadist. How can I actually create a protocol that will make someone overtrain to the point where they have overtraining syndrome? Still not seeing it. And I'm talking disgusting resistance exercise protocols. I mean, even mine is disgusting, and we got it through ethics eventually, because ultimately we need to train someone hard enough so we start to see some symptoms, but we can't train them too hard that we just go, oh, well, that's your season gone. Good luck, off you go. So it's very, very difficult to test for overtraining syndrome, because ethics, and rightly so, won't allow you to actually force that upon an athlete. But then also, who's even going to put their name forward for that?
Yeah.
Oh, you want to fuck me up for the year? Yeah, well, let me put my name down. I'll do it twice. It's not going to work. So, most of the protocols are quite heterogeneous. They're all over the place, and there's lots of different attempts. And some of them are awful. There's one that was 3 sets of 8. So 3 sets of 8 on a few exercises twice a week. And that's not an intentional, that's normal training, mate. That's a light week. Yeah. But then you've got, researchers, really cool researchers like Andy Fry and I've no idea how he got it through ethics, but he was working out what an athlete's 1RM is on a modified leg press, like a bike squat. And he was doing that 10 times a day. So 10 rep maxes a day for 14 days straight.
Yeah.
And then, the first time I read it, I was like, there's a typo. There's something not right with this. But then he started using the same protocol again and again. I was like, this is sick. This is brilliant, But guess what? Not one athlete overtrained. They will add, short-term reductions in performance. Is that not common sense? I think most people would break after a day or two, but, oh, look, your performance decreased. But then we don't know what happened afterwards, because there was no 4-week follow-up.
Yeah. Yeah.
I tell a little bit of a lie in the sense that there was one study where they did an interview, a follow-up interview, and they were just kind of like, how do you feel? Feeling it shit, if I'm being honest. Oh, that's overtraining syndrome. You're like, nah, you can't diagnose a complex medical disorder via interview.
Yeah. Okay. So with that then, what's your protocol at the moment then?
Yeah, so my protocol has been triangulated between speaking to athletes, speaking to coaches, and looking at previous literature. And when I first started talking to coaches, it was just before COVID hit. So I made a conscious decision to speak to coaches. It wasn't a case of COVID's here, we can't get in the lab. But everyone did at that point, it was just come and do my survey, come and do my interview. So it got published just before COVID, and I was really happy with it. We spoke to a bunch of coaches. I was just like, look, if you were going to train someone hard for a microcycle, so a 7 to 14 day time period, what would you do? And everyone would do it differently. And I was like, that's rubbish, because now I haven't got anything that I can actually develop a protocol of. So I kind of used my experience as a coach alongside the literature, alongside what those coaches have got. And ultimately what we arrived at, and we're still in pilot stages at the minute, so we're still kind of looking at finalising it, but we're doing 5 sets of back squats. So this is not a modified leg press, this is actually back squats. So there's lots of axial loading, a lot of training monotony, because it's one single exercise as well. 5 sets of back squat using 80% of the 1RM. It's failure. with 3 minutes rest between sets. So it needs to be standardized. And they repeat that for 5 days, consecutive days. Okay. So ultimately 25 very, very heavy sets. Now, what I was thinking was, and again, we know this from training, that 80% on day one is going to feel heavy. On day two, that 80%, because of fatigue, is probably not 80%, might be 82%, might be 83%. And we wanted to keep the load, like the demand, consistent. So we're using an auto-regulated kind of daily 80%. So, we're using a GymAware to measure the velocity of 80% on that day one, which, so far for athletes is coming in at like kind of 0.7-ish, give or take, 0.75. On day two, we then get them to lift the same load, and if they're moving it slower, we take a little bit of weight off. Or, as magically seems to be happening on occasions, they're coming in feeling beat up, but moving the same load faster, and you're just like, why are you science so hard?
Yeah.
Because again, humans are complex, right?
Yeah.
So then we're adding more load on. But we're keeping the level of intensity the same across the 5 days. Now, originally, we wanted every set to be to absolute failure. Ethics, as you can imagine, had a bit of concern. So we said to repetition failure. So ultimately, when an athlete says, I know I can't do another rep, they shelf the bar, because you can then standardize the amount of effort, the intensity of effort. But also you can validate that by looking at, again, the velocity of the final rep. And the velocities of the final reps so far were coming in extremely slow. Like athletes are grinding those last few reps out to the point where, you look at their 1RM velocity and it's like, 0.25, 0.3 meters a second. These guys are down near like 0.21, 0.22 on a final rep. So it's like they're glitching, they just can't quite, So we were happy with that. But, when we piloted that in the early stages, it was just a bit too much. And I had concerns that we were perhaps running the risk of loading injuries. So we modified it slightly now where we're going to use a velocity cutoff. So when we see that velocity is decreased by about 40% relative to the first rep, we terminate the set. Now, if you calculate the difference, we're probably shaving a rep off.
Yeah.
Sometimes no reps, but about a rep off. And it's just leaving a little bit in the tank for the athletes, because there is a point where, again, we want this to be transferable to practice. So yes, we want to invoke a response, but we also kind of want to go, this could be a way that you might train for a microcycle if you wanted to have planned overreach for a trained population. And this is key because we can't just grab anyone off the street and go, 5 days of squats, best of luck, because there's no way will they get through it. So this had to be trained participants. And when you look in the literature around what trained means, it's typically trained, uninterrupted for a year with weights, has experience in your lift that you choose, in our case, back squat, has a training history of longer than 3 years, and as an absolute minimum can squat 1.5 times their own body mass, which, actually isn't a lot, but does alienate a lot of people that just wouldn't be able to tolerate that amount of load for that many days on their bike. And we're lucky so far, we're in very early stages, but we're getting guys that can, back squat double. We've got one that can back squat 2.7. Like, strong. So the results I'm really happy with, because it doesn't fall into the trap of, actually, the only participants we have are undergraduate students. We need to do this on untrained people. So this will be one of the first studies where we're actually using people that train like this.
Sick. That's really interesting what you're saying around like loading related injuries and like overtraining in itself, and you're constantly pushing and you're pushing and you're pushing. It's finding that it's that knife edge, isn't it, between, okay, are you pushing yourself to the point where performance starts to decrease? I think for me, I probably just wouldn't get to that stage. I'd break, I just never would be able to overtrain, I think, because my knee would give out, or I'd break my hip, or whatever would happen. It'd just go. So I guess in that, have you seen much of that in the literature then? Is there any kind of documentation around like injuries and like thoughts on that?
I mean, take overtraining out of the equation. If you look at injuries in strength sports, per 1,000 hours, they're much safer than, your typical kind of contact sports and intermittent sports. It doesn't mean that injuries don't occur, but injuries in themselves are very multifactorial, and you can't I think it would be very reductionist to just kind of go, it was because of the load that you got that injury. There could be all sorts of different factors, but there's no research on it. But again, I think, let's take our heads out of the research and let's, ask people, when do they tend to get injured? It's when they're training too frequently and not recovering. So I think that, protocols like this, there will always be an inherent risk of some kind of loading related injury. Things like tension-based headaches because of the bar on the trap for so long, lower back injuries because just the sheer amount of load going through the spine, the axial loading. We could have quite easily done this on a leg extension machine, but who overreaches on a leg extension? No one,
Yeah.
So it's about trying to think about all of these different factors, trying to control as many variables as you can, but also making sure that your results are transferable. Otherwise, they have no value. They become very, very mechanistic data, and we kind of move past that from a training perspective.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, mate. So what is it then so what are you analysing with your study then? So what are your markers of overtraining and how they're feeling, that type of thing?
There's quite a few. We have our criterion measure is 1RM. So we have a baseline 1RM, and we actually do a load velocity profile with that as well, so we can test velocities at various stages as we start to move towards the 1RM. They then have a week off. We give them a standardized foundation program, which just allows them to dissipate fatigue. It's not a program where it's going to develop adaptations. It's just about mitigating fatigue so that when they start the protocol, they're pretty fresh. We don't want people coming in feeling beat up already, because that kind of skews the results and increases the chance of them not completing. They then do the 5-day protocol, and then we measure them at plus day 7 to see if they've improved, plus day 14, and then plus day 28, because that will then be the first study that's looked at a 4-week follow-up. And that's just for 1RM, right? We can't do 1RM during the 5-day protocol because they're already training 80%. It's already a lot of load that they're having to deal with. And we didn't want to do a 1RM at plus 24 hours and plus 48 hours or anything like that, because that's not where we would normally test anyway. We would allow that little bit of kind of decompression, a little bit of deloading. But we wanted more kind of daily measures as well to kind of see how things were going. So we put in counter movement jumps. So we're just looking at kind of, typical jump height, peak force, that kind of thing. So we're doing that on a daily basis, and we're using that as the final stage of the warm-up. Again, just a little kind of like, I guess, if we were thinking about our prep as being a ramp protocol, that would be the peak. So they go away, they do the warm-up, and then we do 3 jumps to kind of look at peak force. Then we're also looking at isometric mid-thigh pull as well, which tends to have a lot of correlation, tends to be quite sensitive to fatigue, much like counter movement jump. And again, we're just looking at peak force because it allows us to see how our athlete is able to create force, whether it's decreased, whether it's increased relative to baseline. But that testing itself doesn't accumulate fatigue. It doesn't impact on their day's training. So we're doing that at baseline every day before the protocol at plus 24, at plus 48, and then at 7, 14, and 28. Nice. Because we want to know a little bit about how the athlete feels, we've got perceptual measures as well. Because this is a study that, we're looking to publish hopefully in a relatively good journal, we can't just ask basic questions, how do you feel today? So we looked at what the kind of validated scales were that have been used in similar research. So we use things like the SEEB recovery scale, which, kind of boil it right down is how well do you feel you've recovered from the previous day? And there's a couple of anchor points, not very well, very well, that kind of thing. And then also Hooper Index, which looks at, how sore do you feel on a Likert scale? How well have you slept? Things like that. So it allows us to kind of triangulate again between the objective and the subjective markers. One thing that I was conscious might be a little bit too much, but we are trialing it anyway, is not to control dietary intake, but to observe and record it. So we want to see what happens to athletes' eating behaviors, because we're already asking a lot from participants across that timeline. What we then don't want to do is go, here is your standardized diet, because come on, let's be honest, like people still have lives. What happens if it gets to halfway through the study and they go, coach, like I had a pizza and it said I should have had something else. Like, what do you do?
Yeah.
So we just said, let's record it. Let's use something like Snap and Go. Just take a picture of what you're eating, send it across to me, and then we can just use some software to analyze it. And the reason why I wanted to do that was, and firstly, let's think about common sense. If our athletes are not eating enough and training hard, they're not going to recover very well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But also, one of the exclusion criteria for overtraining syndrome is that there is a reduction in energy availability and carbohydrate intake. So we then might be able to see, hang on, all those that are not improving their performance, the ones that are not eating sufficiently and the right sources of, the right macronutrients. Because if they are, even though, and again, let's kind of hypothesize, let's say that their reduction had decreased at week 4 post-intervention, if that was perhaps because they weren't eating enough, that's still not overtraining syndrome. That's something different. We're probably then moving down the lines of kind of RED, relative energy deficiency in sport, a very similar condition that's led by, low energy availability, but kind of has a lot of crossovers with the overtraining syndrome. To the point that they actually do the same thing. What else are we doing? We did attempt to get some funding for bloods. I wanted to look at some biochemical markers. There's some pretty cool novel markers out there like cell-free DNA, some of the kind of acute inflammatory stuff, C-reactive protein, tumor necrosis factor alpha. Like, there's some pretty cool stuff out there. There's some basic stuff like plasma ion status, but again, like, from what I've told you already, there's a lot of things that we need to do. The athletes would be in the lab all day.
Yeah.
So we just went, look, let's shelf that. Let's run this as a pilot study. And if we start to see trends, that's then when we can go back and we can start to look at more robust methodologies. So all we're doing at the minute, we're just dipping our toe in and going, let's see what happens.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. I was always a little bit unsure. Well, to be fair, again, I just don't know around, like the blood tests you can buy online, and there's, I think they can test for intolerances, and I've seen other ones that do slightly different things. I was always unsure whether there's any weight in them. What's your thoughts there? And
I actually have no idea. I have. Oh, sorry, go on. Yeah.
Microphone's rubbing on your beard. I gave you a compliment for your beard, and now it's like a brush. it's to that side. If you can just separate it a little bit, if you can.
My beard's grown that much during this interview.
It's thick. I've only just noticed it like rubbing. What's your thoughts on like the blood test stuff?
The commercial blood stuff, I have no idea. I mean, I have had people that I've worked with that have gone away and used those commercial companies for very simple measures. But for us, the types of testing that we needed were vena samples, so it were venipuncture. So it required someone that had specialized training, which again just added another layer of complexity to what we needed to do. Like, I've done my phlebotomy training a very long time ago, but I just haven't got time in the lab to be running the GymAware, to be running the Hawkins force plate, to be recording the data, to be making sure athletes are safe as well, to standardize recovery time. And then we're also running around with a needle trying to take blood. So I was going to say it was a conscious decision not to do it, but we didn't get the funding, so we couldn't have done it anyway. But in one sense, I'm kind of glad that we didn't, because it's just one less thing that I need to worry about, but it's not too detrimental to the overall kind of findings, hopefully.
No, that's cool. So the next step then, I think, is kind of a little bit more around deloading itself, potentially. Do you reckon that's the next step?
I reckon so, yeah.
Yeah. So give us, is it real? Why do we do it? What's the kind of background there?
Yeah, so we'd need to take a kind of a journey right back to the kind of foundations of periodization literature there. And, when we talked briefly beforehand there, and we were kind of saying that periodization is based around a lot of biological assumptions, and you can go back to, Hans Ellier's work in the 1950s around kind of general adaptation syndrome, a little bit later on in the late 70s and 80s with fitness fatigue kind of model of training. Where deloads come in is that when we train, we create an adaptation, but in the early stages, that adaptation is masked by fatigue. Yeah, so you've got this fitness and this fatigue element that combines to form our readiness at any given time. So it makes sense then that after a period of training hard, where we're fatigued, that we need time away from training to recover and restore. So, all types of periodization, whether it's a traditional linear approach or undulating, all have these little built-in periods where we go, we need to deload. Or maybe not using, this is where it becomes complicated. They don't often use the term deload. That's, again, it's quite a colloquial term. It might be a lighter week. It might be a restitution cycle. It might be a recovery cycle. They all mean the same thing, but for some reason we just use different language. It's frustrating. A typical kind of approach would be 3 weeks of training that gets progressively harder, then deload. 3 weeks, deload. 3 weeks, deload. 3 weeks, deload. Everyone does it. Why? And you go, well, it's what the literature says. And I look at the literature and I go, it doesn't. Show me the literature. And they go, here you go. And I'm like, no, mate, that's a review. That's someone saying we should do it like this because we've always done it like that. Yeah. Is that not just like an indoctrinated approach to training? I'm not saying that it's necessarily wrong per se, but I'm also kind of saying it's wrong in the sense that there's no scientific backing to it yet. So, thinking back to, when I talked about supercompensation kinetics, and I was saying that people peak at different time points when you allow them recovery, I was thinking, well, that then surely informs the duration of the deload and then what happens during the deload. So this was nothing to do with the PhD. This was just, I was interested in it, and maybe at my own detriment. Sometimes when I'm interested in stuff, I start reading about it and then writing about it. And there were just no studies on deloading whatsoever, or any of the kind of like similar kind of synonym terms. So we created a series. I say we, there was quite a few researchers that kind of combined together to work on a survey study. We were asking athletes, do you deload? How do you deload? And these were all strength and physique athletes. We did the same thing with coaches. We interviewed them and said, do you deload? If you do, why? What do you think you get from that? If you don't, why not? If you do, what does your deload look like? How do you adapt to your acute training variables? And the idea is that then you triangulate it to form a basis for experimental work. We were conscious that if we were to just go, let's set up a study in a lab and use a deload, well, we don't know what a deload looks like. And if we create a deload using our experience, that's our worldview. That's our perception of what a deload should be. So again, much like with the overtraining research, you cast a very broad net and you go, let's ask the experts, what do you do? And now we'll test that assumption. Yeah. So far, there isn't a definition. There's not even a task force definition. So we've proposed a definition for the literature because it needs it. But also, once you've created a definition, it gets cited a lot in other papers, and that's never a bad thing as an academic, right?
Yeah, who knows?
And our definition was ultimately based around, intentionally reducing training stress for a short-term period of time to mitigate fatigue for the subsequent block of training. And the most important bit is our last bit, for the subsequent block of training. Because by its design principles, a deload is very, very similar to a taper. The difference is a taper is always the last block prior to competition. A deload isn't. A deload isn't about improving performance per se. It's just about let's shelf that fatigue so that we can go again in the next block. That was our definition.
Was you finding people approach them in two different ways? I don't know if that was covered in the actual survey, the taper to the deload, or is it very similar except for one has an end block, one doesn't?
The survey is unpublished at the minute. We're just working on analysing the data, but the interview paper has been published. What we found frustratingly was that coaches used the term taper and deload to mean the same thing, which still in itself is quite useful knowledge to know that, again, a bit like the overtraining stuff, we use the same words in different ways, and it's not the same thing. And again, part of our attempt to create a definition was saying, this needs to be separated from a taper, because otherwise what's going to happen is a young coach that's inexperienced, right, my athlete's getting tired, what do? I go to the tapering literature, but it might not be the same thing. And again, let's look back at some of the tapering research, and there's quite a bit in strength and physique sports, and there are different ways that you can do it. You can use a step taper, where you just go, let's slash at volume, maintain that new volume for a week or however long you choose to taper for, and then off we go. Or we might use a fast or slow exponential where it decays at a particular rate over time. People don't deload like that. They might just use the step approach, not the fast or slow exponential. So even though positionality is different, and it might be similar. It might also be very, very different in its design principle as well. So for me, I'm just like, why are we using the same words for two completely different things?
Yeah. It's, mate, questions on questions on questions, isn't it? It's the smarter you get, the better the questions get, but they never really stop.
I just wish I could figure something out one day and be like, I've done it, like I've completed sports science, but I just keep digging just a bigger hole. And I just need someone to just give me a hand and just be like, mate, just come on. You've done enough now. You've tried your best. You can't even define the words.
That's lovely. I love it. Okay, so I guess one of the things I'm curious around actually is technology and its use in identifying overtraining, stress when a deload is needed. And obviously at the moment it's more commercially available. You start looking at Whoop, Aura Rings, all that type of thing. Where it's hard when you start putting price tags to things, because obviously commercializing things and people over-egg it. Does the research back those types of things in terms of being able to identify different markers?
No.
There it is. That's it. That's all I'm going to put out on social media, mate.
And sometimes, mate, silence is a powerful tool. When I did my teaching degree, the teacher of that degree was doing her PhD in silence, and she could just use it so powerfully. And I just attempted to do that then by just not waffling on. It's like, no, silence. It doesn't, because what they've done is they've created an algorithm around a concept that we haven't figured out yet and we can't define. But commercial companies have somehow managed to create an algorithm that goes, you are overreached, you are overtrained, you need to take a step back today. And, I use a watch because I like to monitor my steps. That's all I really use it for, if I'm being honest. But mine pinged yesterday just saying, you're highly stressed, don't exercise today. All I'd done was walk from the car to the lab, just, I think that there's potential to create an algorithm, and I would love to be part of that once we figure this stuff out. Don't get me wrong, perhaps where the money is, which is never a bad thing. I would love that to be able to be a valid and reliable algorithm that says, based around all of these different factors, actually, you probably do need to reel your training back. But how many times have people made training errors where a watch has flashed and gone, you're nearly dead, you need to not train today, and you've gone, oh, I've already got my training shoes on and I was off to the gym because I'm feeling quite good today. How many people have just gone, okay, watch, maybe I don't train today, and then done themselves a disservice because that would have been a potentially pretty cool session. Or likewise, that unfathomable concept of when we go to the gym, we've double scooped our pre-workout, we're buzzing, we're going to, we're thinking we're going to hit PRs, and then we just can't even lift the load. And we're just like, what's happened? Well, watch didn't pick that one up, did it?
Yeah.
So I think that we need to be, again, I keep saying pragmatic, but we need to use a common sense approach when we have wearables, because it's just one part of the puzzle that makes the jigsaw up, and it's only a very small part of it. The rest of the puzzle is basically us, our own perceptions around training.
Yeah, mate, that's sick. And I think, you're right in what you're saying there around we don't know what overtraining is and we can't be clear on those things just yet. So this Garmin or this, what else is there? There's Apple Watches. I don't know if they try and do the same thing as much, Apple Watches. I'm not too sure.
I'll be honest, mate, I'm not going to name any names because, if I get offered a bunch of money to figure this stuff out. So
I love it. No, that's sick. So I guess I have one-ish kind of question then.
Yeah.
For the athletes out there that are kind of worrying or thinking around overtraining, deloading, what's the advice from Dr. Lee Bell then? How are we approaching things going forward based on where you're currently at with research?
Trial and error.
Yeah.
And N1. That's the best way. There's such a variable response to all of this that go away and trial things.
Mm-hmm.
So if you feel that you are in a cycle of training that is highly demanding because you are trying to layer on as much stimulus as possible, if you're feeling sore, that's part of the process. If you're feeling tight, if you've got training apathy, if your sleep is starting to waver somewhat, that's all expected part of the process. That's not ultimately a red flag of, whoa, that's too far. It's fully expected. If you are trying to run a challenging cycle of training while also having, heavy shift patterns, family issues, you're moving house, you've got exams, that's probably not the best time. So unless there's a reason why you have to do it at that point, which I think you're going to struggle to kind of give me a good enough answer for that, then delay it and move it to a time where you can devote all of that stress battery to training. If you start to feel sore, if you start to feel like your mood is changing negatively, you're feeling beat up, but you're in a phase of training where you shouldn't be feeling like that, then you need to ask questions. If you work with a coach, you need to report that to the coach, although a good coach will probably be asking you those questions anyway. If you're self-coached, then look at your numbers. Should this be happening right now? Do you need to take a little bit of time off? And, rewind a little bit to the kind of 3 weeks of training hard, then a deload is, don't be led again by biological assumptions. A lot of coaches now will use an auto-regulated approach to deloading. So we can call it a deload if we want, but not a deload week. It may well be that you have a deload day. So you just go, you know what, I'm just not feeling it today. So there's no point of chasing the numbers. Let's just have a lighter session. Let's get back in the day after, and let's see if we rebound and feel a little bit better. And if we don't, let's have another light day, and let's see what happens. So again, it's all about thinking positionality within the training plan and your own individual response as well. Just don't start trying new things right before competitions.
Beautiful. Mate, I love it. I think that's a really nice point to end on there. Just for anybody that's kind of looking to see what else you're putting out there, mate, do you put anything out on social media? Where can people find you?
So I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Lee, so LEE3ELL. I occasionally put, content around the studies that we've had published. I'm not a content creator as such. I like to share pictures of sneakers and things like that more than anything. So if you're a sneakerhead, any sneakerheads, give me a follow. But I'm always open to discussion on those channels as well. So I'm always kind of checking for messages. So if anyone has questions, wants some of the literature that we've discussed today, then that's the best way to contact me. Or you can get me through my work email, which is lee.bell@shu, so shu.ac.uk.
Beautiful. I'll stick all that in the show notes below, mate. Thank you very much for your time, mate. That has been absolutely sick. I've really enjoyed that. I'm sure there'll be a ton of value in there for people.
Good.
Appreciate that, Lee. Thanks
you. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Adapt Performance podcast. Let me know what you thought about the episode by leaving a review or sending me a direct message. I'm all for receiving the honest feedback to make sure the episodes grow and get better and better. Like, share, subscribing and following all goes a long way to making sure the podcast reaches the right people. Thanks a lot. Catch you next time.